You're listening to an IOE podcast.
Powered by UCL Minds.
Welcome to the Staffroom. I'm Elaine Long.
And I am Mark Quinn.
We are programme leaders on the UCL Early Career Teacher programme. Why are we in the Staffroom? We're here because this is where the best professional learning conversations always take place. This is where problems faced by teachers and leaders today can be explored critically and where meaningful connections between research and practice can be made.
Over the course of the series, we'll hear the voices of different colleagues as they come into the staff room, from ECTs to academics and executive leaders. We will talk about all things education, the challenges and the joys. So why don't you enjoy a coffee with us, perhaps even grab a biscuit and sit down for an hour of staff room chat. Welcome to the staff room, Professor Julie Dockrell. We're very excited to be meeting you today in our festive edition, Julie, because this is the last day for many of us of the autumn term. We're getting ready for Christmas. So rust off your feet, as I'm sure you are. You can sit down in our staff room. We always offer a drink and a biscuit. You did give us an early warning that you had very particular needs at this end of the year. And biscuit wasn't gonna do it. So I'm gonna offer you some mince pies.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for inviting me.
No, you're very welcome. I actually looked around for some mulled wine. I couldn't find any mulled wine, but I did find some spiced mead. So we can crack open some spiced. Is that okay? We'll have some spiced mead.
Yeah.
So some spiced mead and some mince pies, nicely warmed, will get us through our meeting this morning.
And can you pass some of that spiced mead my way, Mark?
I will.
Well, that's lovely. Thank you. Julie, I know you've got a whole lifetime of experience to offer our listeners today, and I'm sure they'll be interested to hear about your role now and your experience working in oral language. So can you tell us a bit more about your role and what brings you the most joy from it?
Well, I'm professor of psychology and special needs in the Department of Psychology and Human Development. And a lot of my role is research and staff development around that. I also run or lead the Social Science Research Council doctoral training program, which is across 6 institutions. And that's been really interesting and challenging. I mean, my view is it's always good to be challenged, to keep your mind sharp and working forward. So those are the things I do. What I get a lot out of, the things I really enjoy. At the moment, I've been really lucky. I've got a couple of early careers researchers who are really interesting and hungry. And it's just a pleasure working and learning with them. So that's one of the things I feel I'm very lucky about. The other aspect of my job, which I find don't do as much teaching as I used to, but when I do teach, I always value the questions and input from the practitioners I'm working with. So it's the teachers particularly who are in the chalk face who say, well, why did the children do this? And, then it starts me thinking about, well, I wonder why that is happening. So those are the 2, I think, exciting aspects of my role at the moment.
You're obviously very at home in a staff room, Julie, and enjoy talking to teachers and being around teachers. So that's one of the reasons why we're really happy to have you as a guest today. And in particular, we want to hear you talk about your interest in oral language and classroom communication. It seems a kind of fashionable topic these days. Am I right in saying it seems to be on the political agenda more than it has been in the past? So I think it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on maybe why that is the case, why it's become more of a priority, I guess, in the policy area. But also tell us, really give us your definitions of, we're using these words oracy and oral language. Maybe you can start by defining for us what those things are.
So, okay, I'll start by defining and then I'll go to the question, or try and tackle the question of why it's trendy at the moment to talk about oracy. So in some ways, it's really difficult to distinguish between oral language and oracy. I mean, there's a subtle difference that people use. But if I start with oral language, which is, I think, most clearly defined and obviously researched, that is effectively an individual's skills and competencies in terms of expressive language, what they can say, but also receptive language and what they understand. And within that, the oral language dimension can be broken down into vocabulary, the grammar and morphosyntax of the language, and our ability to create a narrative or retell. Oracy, I think if it's used in a slightly different way, is the way we use language in different contexts. So the way I'm talking to you now is different to if I was sitting in a pub. It's different to as if I was talking with a group of students, or, you change the ways in which you use language. If you might sort of perhaps the term that people might use is pragmatic use of language. So it's so, and I'd say those two were, if there's a difference, that's where the subtle difference is, but you can't manipulate or use those more subtle aspects of changing your language if you don't have those core language skills to build on.
So oracy or fluency within oracy somewhat depends upon your oral language skills more generally, yeah?
Absolutely. I mean, I can't change my conversation if I don't have the vocabulary to talk about the situation, or the appropriate grammar to use the sentences to create that context.
And when you hear politicians, as we are hearing politicians now talk more about this thing, are they thinking about oral language, or are they thinking about oracy in terms of those registers and those contexts that they think that young people need to be able to be fluent in?
I'd be a very rich woman if I knew what was in the minds of politicians. So unfortunately, I can't say. But I think often they're talking about oracy because they drop in this notion of debating skills and so forth. So I think they're talking about use of language, the flexible use across those different contexts. And it's interesting because often children particularly haven't had the opportunity to develop those skills. So at the moment, I'm working with colleagues in Kent on a Year 4 project that's looking at supporting children's conversation skills and just basic aspects of turn taking, responding to the question that's asked, not off on something that interests you. So in general, I'd say the politicians are talking about those more sophisticated uses of language without the other.
I think some of the politicians could do with a bit of lesson in turn taking, having seen some of those debates in the Houses of Parliament. Julie, I was going to ask you, sorry, I'm an English teacher and I can't help it. I'm curious about this. What do you see as the link between oral language skills and written skills for students?
Okay, so it's a really good question. I think there would be quite a lot of research on oral language and reading. And, there's that early stuff about, phonological skills and phonics impacting on decoding. So that's important. But on top of that, then you've got vocabulary helping, you've got prediction of text. So the reading is really key and well established. The groups of children who have particularly problems with oral comprehension, who can read text, but they don't get the full meaning, the inferences from the text that they're reading. Writing, there much less research done on this, and in fact, it's probably about 16 years ago now, we were doing a project on children who were struggling with language and communication, and I was talking with, it was about the teachers, how they understood how the children were in the classroom, because most of these children are in mainstream classrooms. And one of the teachers said to me at that point, she said, well, I can understand about the language and I can structure my classroom about that. She said, but I can't understand why they can't get their ideas out on paper. And very insightful point, something I hadn't really thought about before. And I went and looked at the literature. And at that time, there were only 2 papers on children who struggled with language and writing. And since then, there's been much more work, and we've had several grants here at the IOE looking at the way oracy underpins text generation and.
So it's a bit like what you were saying about oral language skills being the foundation of oracy. In some ways, you could make the argument that oral language skills are the foundation of reading and writing, or at least there's a really strong connection there, absolutely. I guess.
I have a colleague at the University of Padua who's just recently published a really interesting intervention study. So these were with children, a group of children who were 10, another group who were 15. It's a typical control trial. And one group were given oral language sentence combining exercises. So being flexible, starting with 2 words. So let's talk two easy words: cat and dog. The dog chased the cat. You can play around with that. But she built a whole series of these, and they became more complex in terms of the oral get. And what did she find? Impacted on the written language. They were much more flexible writers.
So I think this really obviously raises the importance of children developing these skills right from the foundations of their education in early years. And I know you've dedicated a lot of time to the question of how teachers can support children to develop these skills. And one of the ways that you've done that is through the C. Scott Communication Supporting Classroom Observation tool. I managed to get that right despite my sip of spice mead. And that tool, correct me if I'm wrong here, but from my understanding and my reading about it, identifies the features of effective oral language environments and then supports teachers to think about how they might incorporate them into their own classrooms and teaching. Do you mind explaining a bit more about that? What's on the tool and why, and what are some of the things teachers can take from that?
Yeah, well, this is a freely available tool that was developed out of a very large research program. We were involved a number of years ago, the Better Communication Research Program, which was from the John Burko's work. And basically what we did was we created what I'm going to call an evidence-informed tool. So these are the aspects in the classroom learning environment which have been shown to be important at supporting children's oral language skills. So there's the environment. So, for example, in a year 1 class, that might be a book corner. There's the opportunities that children have. So if you're sitting in a class with 30 children and you don't have possibilities to interact with your peers or the teacher, you don't actually have any opportunities to practice, and we can talk about those in a bit more detail. And then there are what we call the interactions. And actually, in hindsight, I think it's these interactions that drive language. It's the ways in which we as adults or teachers or learning support assistants talk with children. Now, obviously, talking with children does depend on the situation, and it does depend on having a class that's reasonably quiet where you don't get interference from external noise. But it's the ways in which we talk with children to scaffold their oral language skills. And teachers use this tool differently. So we trialed it, and number of studies looked at, and it's been used in research, but also teachers have taken it away. And in one school I know, they videoed each other. So Senko videoed the 2 teachers. I think it was a year 1 class. I can't be 100% sure. And then they went back and looked at the video, and they thought, this term, let's focus on this. So we'll focus on recasting what children say. And then they went back, so it's their tool. The power is theirs to choose what's right for their classroom, because, what's right for a classroom up the road from where I live might not be what's needed in Brighton or Dover or Scotland, for example.
And it sounds to me like integral to creating high quality talk environments is being responsive to the moment. So necessarily you can't produce a checklist for that, I guess, because it is about being responsive to what the students are doing, but there are a set of skills, it sounds like, that teachers are employing, looking for opportunities to deepen things.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely that's right. But you also have to have the opportunities to do that. So, if you're working with children in smaller groups or pupils in smaller groups, you have an opportunity to interact in that way. If it's activities that the children or the young people have gone away and done themselves, you're no longer part of that, so they don't have access to that opportunity. Or if a child's really quiet and they don't say anything, what do you do with that? So there are a lot of challenges for teachers that, makes me a little bit frustrated with this, RC hand waving, because it's not a new problem.
No. And can I just ask, we're talking about the primary setting here and early years, but thinking up to secondary school, is this something you'd say be equally relevant to children as they progress through their school careers?
Absolutely. I mean, the way in which you use those skills or embed those RC skills within the classroom will differ. But, let's take a, very simple example. I don't know what year in history they talk about fascism, but, imagine.
Year nine. Year nine.
Okay. Well, okay. So year 9, we've got fascism. Teacher gives definition of fascism. Off they go. Well, we don't learn the meanings of words, let alone very complex concepts in one example like that. So embedding those activities throughout, the year and in those contexts will help. And also it will allow children to be able to use this in a fluent way in their written text and what they've got to produce. Science terms are exactly the same. I've had a number of projects science, very complex terms. And the ways in which you use them in the language differ. So, yeah, absolutely important.
It's interesting that you talk about teaching vocabulary, because that's often something that comes up on our ECT practitioner inquiries. They're always, and hearteningly so, really interested in how they can expand their students' vocabulary in primary and secondary. What would you say are some of the best ways of doing that? You've already mentioned some of the importance of using and speaking that word in lots of different contexts and providing the opportunities to do that. Are there any more effective ways that you've seen of teaching vocabulary?
Yeah, one of a colleague who at the University Royal Holloway, she's done some very interesting work. I think it was a year 9, year 10 group, very interesting study where in half the classes, the key vocabulary items for that class were written on the board, and in half they weren't. And guess what? The ones where they were written on the board, the children or the kids in the classroom learned them more, were able to use them flexibly. And I think for all of us, it's important to be challenged. So if you think of yourself being challenged in a situation, going to an evening class to learn a new language, the chances that you're going to pick these things up by just being told whatever the word is and then use it flexibly in your language is about zero.
Yeah. It's interesting. I know you've written elsewhere, Julie, that you don't favor oracy as a kind of subject, but in its own right, you absolutely see it needing to be embedded across curricula, which is, I guess, why you're picking up examples there from history and examples from science. I know that you've got a particular research interest in early years settings. And a lot of the people listening to this podcast work in early years settings, so it would be remiss of us not to give you a chance to talk particularly about that area, and especially a study that I know you've been working on in Tower Hamlets. This is the CPD study around talking time. Is that right? So, What can you tell us about that study and what you're learning from that?
Okay, so it was about 10 years ago where my colleague, Morag Stewart, who's now retired, had been teaching reading in Tower Hamlets, very low read, and she'd been doing phonics work with them, research projects on phonics, and she came back and she was saying to me, phonics I can get, no problem, but they don't understand the words they're reading. They don't know what they don't have that context to understand what they've just decoded really well. So Morag and I started a project there. which we developed from the research evidence. It has three components within it. One is activities around making inferences from books. So this is not that you have to read a book to a group of children and the children are in small groups. It's that you talk about the text you're reading. What do you think's happening next? Why is that going to happen? So you could spend your whole 10 minutes on one page of the book because there's a lot to interact with. So you're helping children develop their inference skills. Another activity that was about vocabulary learning, but around games. The best example I've seen probably about teaching vocabulary to children in these very socially disadvantaged settings was a learning support assistant who was doing Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush. So she had a trail of children behind her out in the playground, and they would brush their teeth and comb their hair. And these were words the children didn't know, but by embedding it in within the game, and there were a whole range of activities like that, acting out games so you can pretend you're going on holiday. And the third one was, we called it hexagons, but it's a narrative text where we took pictures of the local environment, and then you'd put one down and you'd start talking about it, maybe going to the doctor. Have you ever been to the doctor? So key principles were about being in small groups, but also helping the staff ask these open-ended questions. And at the time, we had quite a lot of challenge with the early years, more higher up professionals and organizational people, because they said early years is a time for free play and open access, and you're teaching them. And the argument was, actually, no, what we're doing is playing games with them, and we're using language sensitively around that. Because I'd seen a number of settings where the early years teachers had done created amazing displays. You know, one was, I remember she did it about animals. And who played with it in this disadvantaged nursery? Two little, very articulate girls. And, you know, everybody else was outside running around shouting. So that meant you were building in disadvantage by not giving them the opportunity. There we go.
And this particular CPD, it's got this talking time, is that right? So people can get access to this?
Right. So talking time's the intervention that Morag and I put together, and we published on that. Then during lockdown, unfortunately, or just before lockdown, the Nuffield Foundation funded a trial, which we ran out. And I worked with my colleague at Oxford, Sandra Mathers, who's an expert in CPD, having worked a lot with professionals in that sense, and we refined it. And it's now a trial funded by the Education Endowment Foundation in over 140 early years settings, primarily in disadvantaged ones. So the information, you can see the videos, and there's information and there's work published about it. Just want to highlight one thing that's different about what we aim to do with talking time than some other types of interventions that are out there. Talking time is meant to be universal within the setting. So it's not just that staff pick out the children who they think are struggling, because actually we're quite bad at picking out 4-year-olds who are struggling. It is a universal intervention, which will be more appropriate in certain areas where there are red flags that children are likely to struggle with oral language, but it is not in the jargon, it's not a tier 2 or a withdrawal or anything like intervention. It's the way in which we talk with children and should have that opportunity. But, staff are in very difficult situations and they don't have the training.
Well, in fact, I know that this is another theme that you're interested in, Julie, which is the one of the barriers to embedding better oral language in classrooms is the skills that teachers maybe don't have and haven't had the training to acquire. And of course, you're in Elaine and I work on the early career framework, and so we're particularly interested in early career teacher development. So and one of the areas, of course, lots of our teachers work in classrooms that where there are many languages spoken, and and I know that you have an interest, particularly in those early language, the development of early language, that for children who might have experienced their early language development in another language.
Sure.
So they're now being taught, let's say, in English, but their mother tongue is something different. And that affects obviously the way they think and the way they communicate, and perhaps also the way they learn. So if you're a teacher in that context, in multilingual classrooms, what do you think is helpful for teachers to know about how they can develop those classroom communication skills in those contexts for those children?
It's clearly a challenge, and there are different types of multilingual classrooms that exist. And I think that's really important because, people talk about translanguaging, hopping between languages. Well, that's fine if there are 2 languages or even maybe 3 languages in your school. But if you've got 50 different languages going in the school, this is just not going to be feasible in terms of what you do. I mean, of course, it is exceedingly important about what a lot of schools do is acknowledge the diversity of languages, because all languages need to be respected in that way. But for the teacher, I think it is particularly challenging. I think the important thing, there's sort of principles to do. So it's not that the children are going to learn the language differently. They may need things broken down. So if you are a 10-year-old but only have, the oral English language of a 5-year-old, then the way in which the language is used will have to be restructured, if you like. But the concepts need to be there, because just because you don't have the language doesn't mean you don't have the cognitive skills and ability to engage with that. So that's the first thing. And I think the other issue about it is to be aware of a distinction. So there's a distinction that runs across languages that they talk about in terms of transparent or opaque orthographies. So that's real jargon for you here. But a transparent orthography is one pretty much where you write the word the way it sounds.
Sure.
Okay. So you get that in Italian, pretty much, as a transparent orthography. English, by contrast, is one of the worst in terms of orthography. So it's extremely difficult, So, if children are brought up with a language where the orthography is more transparent, this will become a particular challenge that they need to address. The other side about that is that transparent orthographies often have, again, a little bit of jargon, more complex morphology. That's the way the word is made up. So within the word, in more complex morphologies, you can have a word will give you plurality, it will give you gender, it might give you something about a verb. So it's got a lot more information.
All built into the individual
one word.
Yeah.
Yeah, which you don't get in English. English is very simple. So challenging for teachers, but always interesting to think about why that error might be happening and how much it links back to, the original language, and to use that as a learning point, Right.
So what I've understood from that, Julie, so English is opaque in its orthography. In other words, it's difficult to spell, and therefore it'll be difficult to sound out. It will be difficult to read if English is not your home language, and particularly so if your home language has what you've said is a transparent orthography. In other words, essentially you say what you see, so you can sound it out pretty predictably. The letters will sound almost the same in any context. But so that's one problem between English and some other languages. But another issue, which is almost the reverse of that, is that English is simple in other ways. So the word pretty much stands the same, more or less, wherever it appears in a sentence. We add an S when we want to make it plural, but pretty much every other time it's almost the same. Whereas in other language, which might be more simpler to spell because they have these, they are transparent in their spelling, might be more complex in other ways, which means that they build into words the gender of the word, the tense perhaps of the word, or the meaning within the sentence of that word. And all of that is built into the wiring of that young learner, because if they've developed their language skills in a different language, or a language which behaves differently to English, they're going to find the transition into English more difficult. Do I get points for explaining that well?
Yeah, you get 10 out of 10. But it's what makes language so exciting. It really is. And I mean, I think that is an opportunity in a classroom to think about language, not to become so English-centric, and explore whys and wherefores of these different aspects.
But obviously it would be helpful if teachers just know that, right? Just to recognize that that's what English is like, and other languages are not always like that.
Yeah.
I was just thinking that often it can feel like as a teacher, people are just increasingly adding things to your workload. And we might have early career teachers listening, and I have to know about this and do that. But I think what I'm very much hearing is this isn't about an addition to your workload. This is the lens that you shine on all your teaching, and an awareness and an ability to constantly look for opportunities to further children's oral language skills, and think about what oral language skills they'll need to access the curriculum you're teaching. So you're advocating a holistic approach, really.
Yeah. And it's how you can problem solve it around. So there are two aspects I'll drop in from my master's teaching. There are two examples that I use that often, and these are to teachers, these are experienced teachers. They sit back and think, oh, well, I didn't know that. So you might both know this. One of the first lectures I start by is describing, asking if anybody knows what the definition of a hoyden is. And they all look at me like, I've come off the planet Mars. And of course, a hoyden is a boisterous young woman. And I explain that, right? And then we get to 3 hours later at 8:30 at night. And just about everybody can remember that I mentioned that, but virtually nobody remembers what that word meant. And these are highly intelligent, articulate, and that's just a one. And the other one about morphology. So we've agreed that English isn't a very morphologically rich language. There's inflectional morphology, those S's and the EDs, you can get in the past tense. But there is a bit of derivational morphology. And one of the most interesting words about derivational morphology is how words come from or developed from other sorts of words. And we talk about blueberries because they're blue, and, we do the berries like that through that. Raspberries, why are they like that? And then why is a strawberry? And people look at me like, I go, well, of course, a strawberry is a strawberry because initially it was grown on straw. So that that it wasn't eaten by the slugs or go moldy in the wood. So those are quite fun things to do and to learn about yourself, I think.
Yeah, and it makes me think about the experience of students in classrooms who find language harder to access for various reasons, and what it must be like to be in a classroom and exist in a sea of words that your teacher is talking for a long time and you can't access them because they don't make sense to you, and then you're not going to access the learning either. And I think that's so crucial for me, because a lot is made about the importance of explanations in classrooms now, which are really important. But within that, I think it's even more important that no one's going to understand the explanation unless they understand the words you're using, unless you're constantly giving them an opportunity to learn those words in different contexts as well, and to talk about them themselves, I think. It's really, really important. I think having an awareness of that can improve classroom experience for a lot of students. In terms of oral language skills, I think one of the things we should mention is they're not just linked to academic progress, but also someone's progress as an individual and as a human. And pastorally in schools, they become very, very important. And we know that poor oral language, special needs, social disadvantage are all characteristics associated with school exclusions. And it can be difficult for a teacher to remember that poor communication is not the same thing as misbehaviour, especially when they occur together. In your research and experience, have you seen any good examples where teachers have particularly broken this link?
Well, with my psychologist hat on, I'll say links are associations. So you have to think about what those links are between them, what those drivers are. But in terms of practicalities in classrooms, yes, I mean, I've seen teachers use, very simple techniques just to help children. This is probably more primary children, but also understand, how they ask a question if they don't know, using, red, green, and amber little stickers to see, where we are with things, and bending things down so that they help. This conversation project that we're doing with Kirsten Abbott Smith University of Kent. I mean, it's just, if you don't know what a conversation exchange is, how are you ever going to manage negotiation with your peers or with a teacher? And also good teachers check that somebody's understood what they've said, because, you can go off completely in the wrong way if you think somebody's being rude when actually they don't have a clue what you're saying and they're just agreeing with you,
I think that's really vital, actually, in having worked in education for a long time and looked at a lot of incident forms of behaviour incidents. I think sometimes that miscommunication or misinterpretation is vital as well.
Yeah.
Well, we are getting to the end of our bottle of spiced mead, so I guess it's time to bring the conversation to a close. But we always give our guests a post-it note to write some advice on. So I'm going to hand you over your post-it note, Julie. What would you like to write on it, and who would you like to give it to, or where would you like to stick it? You can put it anywhere.
Okay. So I thought a little bit about this, and what I'd like on this post-it is listen, reflect, and check you've understood or you've been understood. And then maybe I'd have a second one and say act and respond then. It's all very listening, but you need to do something with that. I'd stick it on my own computer before I say anything to make sure but I would also think that this is relevant for all of us as adults. And particularly, I think, I don't know whether you've encountered this, but I have. As individuals progress through the academic hierarchy, they tend to deliver rather than listen. And we should all listen, because we can go to the next step.
Do you know, Elaine, I was just thinking there that in all the times and all the guests we've had coming into the staff room, I don't think we've ever had a guest who gave the post-it note to themselves. And that is refreshing, and it's true, isn't it? That advice we give to others, we might start by giving to ourselves. I can hear some jingle bells in the background, which tells me that replacing the normal school bell, which tells us we have sadly come to the end of our conversation, Julie. It's been really great to listen to you this morning. I've got crumbs all over me from the mince pies that I've been munching while listening. Elaine, we know, is a little bit tipsy on that spiced mead, but it's been a great pleasure to listen to you and to talk to you today. And we wish you best luck in all the rest of the work that you're doing. Happy Christmas and a great 2025.
Yeah, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. And thank you very much for having me and listening and reflecting with me.
Our thanks go to Professor Julie Dockrell, Professor of Psychology and Special Education at UCL, for sharing spiced mead and mince pies with us this week in the staff room.
Please do get in touch if you'd like to be part of the conversation. Click on the link at the bottom of the UCL Staff Room webpage.
If you've enjoyed this episode, there's more where that came from. Search IOE Podcast from wherever you get your podcasts to find episodes of the staff room, as well as more podcasts from IOE.
And a quick favour before you go. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we'd really appreciate it if you could give the IOE podcast a rating. 5 stars would be nice if you're enjoying the show. And that will help us to reach more people who are interested in hearing what the staff room is all about.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast.